To start this review, let's go back right to the beginning, all the way back to the 14th of November 2020. When Grand Peace Online released, it was a fairly big hit, and a lot of prominent Roblox anime YouTubers at the time, like Ibemaine, were quick to make content on the game. Now, I didn't start making videos till quite a while after this, but I can assure you that I was there on the day of release. When the game was released, there were 12 islands and 6 devil fruits. Bear in mind, at this point there were more logias than both rares and common fruits combined. Alright, now that I've briefed you onto the history of the game, let's jump all the way to the day that I'm writing this script. It's the 1st of March 2022, and surprisingly Grand Peace Online is still very much alive. If you really want to get into the numbers, then I guess you could make the argument the player count has declined, but in reality, long-time players of the game will likely know that the game tends to follow a trend of dips and peaks in player count based almost entirely on when updates are released. The Valentine's Day update just recently released, and while some people were disappointed, the overall attitude of the GPO community as a whole towards the update seems to be positive. There is also a degree of hope towards a potential move away from event updates and back to more main game focused updates, something the community has been asking for quite a while now. The game itself has transformed massively since its release over a year ago. There are, at the time of recording, 3 times as many fruits as there were on release, and many more islands and bosses too. It's because of how much content is in the game that I've decided to make this full game review. Now, I've been rambling for quite a bit, but I thought a long introduction would be necessary for a video like this, as without it, people may lack the understanding of where the game came from and what the future may look like too. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into the actual review, starting with my thoughts on the early game. When it comes to the early game of Grand Peace Online, there really isn't much to highlight. Like most anime Roblox games, and One Piece Roblox games in particular, it is a lot of grinding the same bandit style quests for XP. However, there are some unique, and I use that word lightly here, quests that stand out among the rest. These are also strangely found more commonly in the early and late game, and there's very little deviation in between. Some examples of these include exploration quests, where you have to transport water or food between islands. These are actually really useful as they help familiarize me with the map layout and where all the islands were. Furthermore, another feature that isn't just a bandit quest are the many boss quests in the game. Grand Peace Online has a wide range of bosses, and as you would expect, they get progressively more challenging the further into the game you go. The early bosses really aren't all that difficult, and the first boss serves to help familiarize players with the in-game combat, and the second provides them with a unique challenge in the form of a ranged boss using a bazooka. This is of course the Lucid boss. However, this second boss is largely still just preparation for the first real interesting boss, in my opinion. You see, the bosses before this next one really didn't have much to separate them from the bandits that were surrounding them, apart from of course the giant bazooka in the second of the two. The next boss is Grand Peace Online's take on the One Piece character Axe Hand Morgan. The developers behind the game masterfully disguised his identity by renaming him to Axe Hand Logan. So Axe Hand Logan is actually a fairly underrated boss. He has a unique block break which hasn't been seen in any bosses before him, and he even has the unique mechanic of summoning marine soldiers to fight for him. Unfortunately, most of these features were overshadowed by his biggest weakness: a wall. Yes, that's right, the first real boss can be beaten by simply climbing any of the many walls and buildings around him and spamming ranged moves. Now, I wish this was a unique strategy for defeating this boss, but in reality, ever since the game's been released, almost every boss was, and still is, easily defeatable by practicing a similar strategy of hiding behind a wall, climbing a wall, or trapping the boss in a small space. However, this did make bosses that weren't easy to beat like this much more interesting and enjoyable to fight. Another thing to mention is along the way, players are rewarded with boss drops that are fairly useful and interesting, at least at a surface level. There are also a few options to buy a myriad of other items along the way, and these include shovels, boats, cannonballs, and potions. However, and this is something I want to mention now, many items and mechanics in GPO become irrelevant almost as soon as you get them. Shovels are practically useless once you leave the first island. Potions are rarely used by players, especially in the late game, and cannonballs serve little to no purpose since they're, all things considered, not very useful against NPC ships, and naval combat in GPO, if it happens at all, is dominated by large AoE ranged logia attacks that often just melt ships until there is literally nothing left. And once you leave Shellstown, you're not really in store for many changes in terms of the type of NPC you'll be fighting. One big change you'll experience though is the introduction of fighting styles. Weirdly, players aren't introduced to fighting styles until Baratier with Blackleg and later with Electro and Fishman, on the main progression route that is. Most strange of all though is the fact that one sword style is not found anywhere along the main progression route. In fact, the island where you'll find one sword style does not even have any fightable NPCs or bosses. The island is simply a large island, one of the largest in the First Sea in fact, with a series of caves and a small village on top. In this village you'll find a katana for sale. Fortunately, most of the fighting styles in the game are definitely viable for farming, and they all look incredible and have fairly high combo potential, and now with the addition of a separate Geppo trainer, some are even viable in the current meta against things like logia builds that are more traditionally the meta. The rest of the early game is much the same, going from one island to the next, farming NPCs and bosses, and collecting items and weapons along the way. If you're lucky, you'll obtain a fruit along the way, which will make this process much faster. Even a rare fruit will do. Bomu is known for being very useful for farming due to its high damage and large AoE. In the rest of the First Sea, some highlights are the Arlong and NL boss fights, which are a little bit different and interesting than the rest of them. I would even argue that the early game itself probably finishes once you reach Skypiea. After this, you're entering into the mid game, which has some unique elements, but really doesn't differ all that much from the early game. This is not really a thought out classification, but I would roughly say between Skypiea and the start of the Second Sea is the mid game currently in Grand Peace Online. At this point, you should have accumulated quite a few drops from the early game, but are definitely nowhere near being able to really participate in the late game, which in my opinion is the best part of the game, so it's kind of unfortunate, but that's okay. The next few islands are interesting enough, and Fishman Island offers a unique entry system, which is a maze for those who don't know. Although this can get frustrating, it does add a level of uniqueness to the island, especially in a sea of islands with very few practical differences. You may also be exposed to the sea beasts at this point, or perhaps even before it if you're speedrunning. This will help you obtain your first set of armor, a style of drop that has become increasingly popular ever since it was first added to the game. Armor was definitely an interesting drop idea for sea beasts, so I definitely think it was probably a net positive for the game, and there's been loads of cool armor sets since. Another key style of item you'll obtain around this time is the cape, and there have been better capes since, but really you could probably still get by with something like the Marine cape or the Whitebeard's cape. If you made it to this point of the game, you're probably not turned away by grinding. Well, at least I hope you're not, because you're definitely not done just yet. A large portion of the rest of the game's content is grinding, and very few changes were made during this period, so this is especially true for the mid-game in Grand Peace Online. I have decided to classify this next part as mid to late game, as I really want to save the term late game when I'm discussing what you can do in the game once you're finally done leveling. Anyway, moving along, it's at this stage that you'll make the journey to the Second Sea, and like most of the cool sounding words I use in this video, I use the word journey lightly. It's a small trip through Reverse Mountain with a fairly interesting precondition, but I honestly found that precondition to be quite annoying. You have to go into this like sea beast infested area and get the scroll, but it was more trouble than it's worth in my opinion. However, that being said, there is a giant monkey that opens the door, so taking that into account, it might be the game's strongest feature. In all seriousness though, once you get to the Second Sea, there isn't all that much to do just yet relative to the amount of content in the First Sea. The first island you'll visit is the Desert Kingdom, and all things considered, this island adds a bunch of new content. Firstly, we get Carouse, which I don't think anyone would say is a bad addition. It's literally a mount, the first mount in the game, and you can race with it, and you can ride around, and it's just overall a good addition. I've never heard somebody say they didn't like this in the game. There are also a bunch of transport and delivery quests on the island, but they're a little obsolete since the XP here isn't amazing and it gets almost as repetitive as bandits after a while. But I will give credit where credit is due. It was definitely a cool addition, and I can't say it's a bandit beater island in that sense. The island also features interactive NPC civilians and an island guard system, which at the time of its addition completely surprised me and really shows the GPO has some really unique features, especially among the sea of clones in the One Piece Roblox game space. The game has also pioneered a number of other features that I'll get to later when I discuss the late game, and I mean pioneered, like I didn't know of any games that had these before GPO introduced them, and even if they did have them, they were certainly not on the level of quality that GPO had. There are a few more additions outside of the Desert Kingdom, like for example the two sword style guy, who at the time of writing this script I have never actually thought. Kraken farming is also common at this stage in the game, as the Kraken armor basically serves as the upgraded form of the Sea Beast armor. I'm also just now realizing that I forgot to mention Haki throughout this entire review, so I'll discuss it here instead. So players can learn Haki in its different forms at 3 key points in the game. At around level 80 you can learn the armament Haki, which is the bare minimum of fighting logias or bosses like an L, and later around level 165 you can learn observation Haki, which can serve as a useful alternative to logia dodges if you don't have those. Then later in the second sea you can learn the second version of armament Haki, and this one has a cool color too, which is nice as you could choose the color. It's not just set as the black of normal Haki. Now with that I think I can move on to the true late game content, the stuff that I really want to talk about, and I may have missed a few things or not delved deep into certain attributes like bosses, but that is largely either because I didn't find them particularly interesting or I don't think they need as much focus as other areas of the review. Also, please do consider I am talking like in hindsight. I haven't actually played this part of the game in quite a while. I've been max level for every update since update 0, so I really haven't had that chance to just play through it as it released, but hopefully in my next reviews I can really put myself in the position of somebody who's coming at the game from just like the first perspective. Like it's not like I already am max level and I have to go back, and for now let's keep moving and finish this review. Alright, finally I can talk about my favorite part of the game, the end game. As somebody who enjoys GPO PvP more than most, if not all other areas of the game, the end game in GPO is actually not all that bad. While unrewarding, the GPO PvP arena system does provide a good, fast and fair 1v1 matchmaking system for players to test out new builds and overall just explore and enjoy this side of the game. Obviously it's subject to Roblox, so it occasionally is down or it's slow, but that's really not something that GPO does can really solve. It's just a Roblox issue. But like I said, its main downside is that it's largely unrewarding. Yes, I get that they give out fruits to the leaderboard winners or whatever, but what about the thousands of other players who will never reach the leaderboards? Realistically, this is not a good way to reward players because you're just gonna isolate a bunch of the players. And people complain that the arena system isn't balanced or fair, and while this is true to some extent, there are plenty of interesting builds that you can make with rare fruits that are in the right hands, can hold up and even defeat a lot of more traditional meta logia builds. It's all about how you make combos and how good you get at those combos. Another key endgame system is the trade hub. I suppose this isn't necessarily exclusively an endgame thing, and you can really trade from as early as you want, but it's largely a place where people with lots of rare items will go and try and attempt to trade upwards or throw items at people for exclusive collectible drops, like the infamous overpriced candy cane or prestige candy cane. The trade hub, all things considered, is one of my favorite features of the game. It helps provide value to collectible items while also simultaneously facilitating player-to-player interaction, and has grown into this fun, confusing and often frustrating in-game economy in which the values of items changes vastly depending on who you ask and when you ask them. The last endgame feature of note is dungeon mode. Now my thoughts on this are a little bit controversial. I personally think the term dungeon is a little misleading in this case. In reality, it's more of a wave system, and once you get past that small issue though, from a practical perspective, it does offer players an easier way to obtain devil fruits, since you are guaranteed a fruit every time. It's also reached a point now that attempting to change dungeon mode might honestly upset more people than it would please, and people like dungeon mode for what it is, a relatively easy method to obtain fruits. Making it unnecessarily complicated and challenging for players without any significant change in reward might lead to the community reacting negatively. In the end though, it isn't the only way to obtain fruits, and you can always just become a big GP YouTuber like me and ask your subs for fruits, and that's been pretty successful for me. I've got like a bunch of legendaries, but again, all jokes aside, there are plenty of alternatives to obtaining fruits outside of dungeons. However, I do wish they incorporated devil fruit rewards into the PvP arena system in a way that would make it non-exploitable. Obviously that's a key point here. I think making the more fun part of the game more rewarding would actually be a net positive for the game, but that's just my opinion and I don't speak for the entire community. In conclusion, Grand Peace Online is at face value fairly similar to most other One Piece games out there currently. However, what sets it apart is its high quality visuals and its relatively unique systems and community. I personally think GPO is, by quality standards alone, the best Roblox One Piece game game. I also think its PvP system is relatively enjoyable, especially once you figure out what you're doing and start experimenting with new builds and creating new combos and all this sort of stuff. The trading system is also interesting as it is attached to a flourishing player-driven economy, and the game does have a lot in common with other One Piece Roblox games though, so if you're not a fan of that repetitive bandit beta leveling system, then you may not enjoy GPO, especially at the early stage, and really all the stages until late game. That's the only time when grinding bandits really stops. However, what GPO does well is that, in my opinion, it is a leader in terms of optimizing a lot of the core elements of One Piece Roblox games. I mean, sure, it still has bandits, but they're not as easy or as bland as typical bandits, and the bosses, especially later in the game, have quite a lot of things that separate them from normal bandit NPCs. My point is the GPO doesn't deviate too far from the standard One Piece Roblox game, but it does certainly do this model justice and often improves in key areas like I mentioned before. Bandits, that's one key area. Now, to end this review, I think I should give you guys some sort of quantifiable score that I can then use to reference this against other games in the future, but using stars seems a little bit overused, so in the spirit of GPO, I'll be using Sukes, and that being said, I will give the game 4 Sukes out of 5. Now, you can take from that what you will. Obviously, this scoring is the first that I'm doing in this review series, so it might change in the future, but for now, I'm going to go with this one. And if you enjoyed this video or found it informative, then please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. And make sure to comment down below what game you would like to see me review next. And as always, I hope you have a great day, evening, whatever time it is for you, and I will see you in my next video.